Welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology Lab number 4. This week we'll be covering the appendicular skeleton as well as the articulations and movements of the human body. We'll be starting off with quiz number 3, which will cover the material from last week's lab as well as the pre-lab content for the current week. We'll be using exercises 10 and 11 in a lab manual to review the appendicular skeleton and articulations and movements, and a lab workbook assignment has been posted to Blackboard for you to complete during your lab section. The appendicular skeleton is composed of 126 bones of the appendages, which is comprised of the upper and lower extremities. These appendages are attached to the axial skeleton, which we learned about last week, via the pectoral and pelvic girdles. So we're going to start off by talking about the bones of the pectoral or the shoulder girdle and the upper limb. So the upper extremity is attached to the axial skeleton via the scapula. So it has a direct bony attachment to the scapula, and the scapula is attached to the axial skeleton via the clavicle. So the clavicle is the only bony attachment of the upper extremity to the axial skeleton, so it's a very important bone. It's relatively small, and as you can see, unlike most long bones, it's actually sigmoid in shape. So it's not a straight bone. It actually has two curvatures. We have two articular surfaces on the proximal end or the medial end. We have the articulation with the sternum, or more specifically the manubrium. And on the lateral end, we have the attachment with the acromion process of the scapula. And you can see here on the inferior view that the articular surface of the lateral end of the clavicle is relatively small and relatively flat. So unfortunately, due to this design, it is relatively unstable. Due to the sigmoid shape, it's a relatively easy bone to identify. Unfortunately, it's much more difficult to actually distinguish between left and right clavicles. Perhaps the easiest way to do that is to use the primary bony projection, the conoid tubercle, which is attachment site for some ligaments. It's the largest one on the bone, and it's located more distally or laterally, and it's found on the inferior border of the clavicle. Moving on to the scapula, we can see that the scapula is a relatively large flat bone. It has a glenoid cavity, which serves as the articular surface for the upper extremity, specifically the head of the humerus. Here we can see the acromion process that serves as the attachment site for the clavicle. As we look at this inferior view, we see that the surface is relatively flat. This serves as an attachment site for one of the major shoulder muscles. And if we look at the posterior view, we see we have a similar arrangement with one obvious exception. The spine of the scapula here, which really separates the posterior aspect into superior and inferior areas. This spine serves as attachment site for some of the back muscles. And these depressions or fosses located superior and inferior to that serve as attachment sites for muscles responsible for shoulder motion. Moving down to the humerus, the more proximal attachment site is via the head of the humerus. And the more distal site has the articular surfaces for both of the forearm bones. So more medially, we have the articular surface for the ulna. It's called a trochleus, so it has kind of an hourglass or spool shape. And just lateral to that, we have the capitulum, which is relatively round and serves as an articular surface or attachment site for the radius. And so to distinguish between right and left, we know that the head of the humerus has to be oriented medially towards the midline of the body to attach to the scapula. And more distally, we can use the epicondyles to make a distinction between the lateral and medial side. So the lateral epicondyle is much larger than the medial epicondyle. We can also use the depression or fossa on the backside, the olecranon fossa, it's a pretty obvious concavity at the distal end of the bone. This is located posteriorly and accepts the olecranon process of the ulna when it is fully extended. Moving down to the forearm and specifically looking at the elbow joint itself, we can see here a little more clearly the articulation between the two bones of the forearm and the arm. So the trochlea has a notch or a groove, which corresponds to the ridge in the trochlear notch of the ulna. And so essentially this allows the ulna to track in a single plane. So it really constrains the motion of the ulna during elbow flexion. And so you can see here the articulation of the radius isn't quite as tight as with the ulna. And in fact, over here we can see that there's actually a space between these two articular surfaces. And this is often the case, the only time we have direct bone-on-bone contact between these two articulations is when we have compressive force directed upward from the hand region. So really this articulation does nothing to stabilize the elbow joint. Most of the stabilization is afforded by the bone congruity between the ulna and the radius. And so we have a little different arrangement in the forearm than the arm. We can see that in the forearm we have two bones that lie parallel to each other. Most medially we have the ulna, and lateral to that we have the radius. If we look at the proximal end, we can see that the ulna has the primary articulation at the elbow joint. So it has a much larger articular surface than the radius. We have the opposite configuration more distally. More distally, we have a larger articular surface with the radius than the ulna. And here we have a closer view of the proximal end of the ulna that articulates with the humerus. And so we can see here that ridge that tracks in the trochlear notch. We can also see the radial notch in which the head of the radius articulates directly with the ulna. Moving down to the hand, we have much more complex arrangement in the hand. We have essentially three groups of bones that are broken up into the carpal bones, or we typically associate with the wrist bones, the metacarpal bones, which make up the flat portion of our hand, and finally the phalanges, which make up our fingers. So the most proximal group of bones, the carpals, we have 8 irregularly shaped bones that are arranged in 2 rows of 4. So the most proximal row that has the primary articulation with the forearm, more specifically the radius. Starting medially, we have the scaphoid, or laterally, sorry, we have the scaphoid. Medial to that, we lunate the triquetrum, and balanced precariously on top is the pisiform. In the more distal row, laterally we have the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. So these really serve as a foundation for the carpals to facilitate motion at the level of the fingers. So the metacarpals are labeled 1 through 5, starting laterally. So the first metacarpal is the thumb. The 5th metacarpal is associated with the pinky finger. And for the phalanges, we have 3 distinct rows of phalanges for the fingers. So we have a proximal row, a distal row, and an intermediate or middle row that allows us to grasp objects. For the thumb, we only have 2 rows. There's only distal and proximal rows, so we don't have this middle or intermediate phalanx separating the proximal distal row of the thumb. Moving down to the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is formed by the coxal bones and the sacrum. So the sacrum we learned about last week when discussing the axial skeleton. The coxal bone, we find a coxal bone on both sides. The coccyx bone is comprised of 3 separate bones that are fused together. Most superiorly, we have the ilium, which is a relatively large, flat bone. Most inferiorly, we have the ischium, and most anteriorly, we have the pubis. And to give you a better indication as to how these bones join together, here we have them shown in 3 distinct colors. And so the ilium is the most superior, and so up here we have the iliac crest, which serves as an attachment site for a lot of the lumbar and trunk muscles. And the flat surface posteriorly serves as an attachment site for a lot of the hip muscles, primarily the hip extensors and abductors. And if you notice, the 3 bones really join in the acetabulum, which is the articular surface for the femur. So the articular surface of the femur, the femoral head, actually articulates technically with 3 different bones. And most inferiorly, we have the ischium, whose prominent feature is the ischial tuberosity, which is also referred to as the sit bone. So this is where all your weight is transferred through to your seat when you're in the seated position. And anterior to that, we have the pubis. The thigh consists of the femur. The most proximal articulation is the femoral head, so this sits in the acetabulum of the coxal bone. And so it has a similar arrangement to the arm. One major difference is that the neck is much larger for the femur than it was for the humerus. And you can see that's oriented more horizontally than the humerus was. So this has implications for injury, specifically femoral neck fractures, due to the high shear forces that this bone experiences due to its more horizontal orientation. And more distally, on the anterior surface, we have an articulation with the patella that glides over this patellar surface. And posteriorly, we have the medial and lateral condyle, which articulate directly with the tibia below. And so just like the humerus, we have both a medial as well as lateral epicondyle. And just like the humerus, we know that the femoral heads have to be oriented medially to go into the coxal bones. And to distinguish between anterior and posterior views, we can actually look at the articular surfaces. So in the anterior view, the articular surface is relatively continuous across the width of the front of the bone, whereas if you look at the posterior view, the articular surfaces are either on the medial aspect or the lateral aspect. And there's a huge concavity or fossa between the two, the intercondylar fossa. The patella is a sesamoid bone. It's triangular in shape. So it's free floating. It's contained within the tendon of the quadriceps. And we can see here that it is more pointed on the inferior border, so the apex, and has a much smoother surface posteriorly. The articular surface or the posterior surface of the patella is much more smooth than the anterior surface. Moving down to the leg, we have a relatively similar arrangement as the forearm. We have 2 bones that lie parallel relative to each other. So most medially, we have the tibia, and lateral to the tibia, we have the fibula. One major distinction between this arrangement, between the leg and forearm, is if you notice on the proximal articulation, we have no articular surface of the fibula with the femur. All the articulation at the knee is with the head of the tibia, specifically the tibial plateau, with the femoral condyles. Whereas distally, we actually share an articulation with the bones of the foot, specifically the talus that would sit in here. And so we have bony projections that hang down both medially and laterally from the tibia and fibula respectively. So the medial malleolus and lateral malleolus. So lateral malleolus is that bump you feel on your ankle. Going down to the foot, very similar structural arrangement as the hand. We have 3 different regions of the foot, so the bones are broken down into 3 different regions. We have the tarsals, which are comprised of 7 tarsal bones. We have the metatarsals, which, much like the hand, form the flat portion of the foot. We have 5 metatarsals, and we have the 3 rows of phalanges. So the back of the foot, the 2 largest bone is the talus and calcaneus. So the talus affords the articulation with the leg. So the fibula articulates with the lateral aspect, and the tibia articulates with the most superior and medial aspects. The calcaneus is the largest bone and first to come into contact while running or walking. So this is where your heel bone is located. Anterior to the talus, we have an articulation with the navicular, and anterior to the calcaneus, we have an articulation with the cuboid. So these are similar to the distal row of carpal bones. And we have 3 cuneiform bones, the lateral, intermediate, and medial. So these serve as essentially the foundation for motion of the metatarsals as well as phalanges of the feet. And so the metatarsals, just like the metacarpals, are numbered 1 through 5, but just to make things really confusing, they're actually numbered from medial to lateral. If you remember, the first metacarpal was a thumb, and it was actually oriented or located laterally, whereas the first metatarsal is associated with the big toe, and it's located medially. Just like the fingers, we have 3 rows of phalanges, proximal, middle, and distal, except for the big toe. We only have a proximal and distal row of phalanges. As far as articulations and body movements, the articulations or joints perform 2 primary functions. One is hold the bones together, and the other is to allow the rigid skeletal system some flexibility. So this really affords or provides movement of the skeleton. They can be classified in 1 of 2 ways, either structurally. They can be classified as fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. So this classification structure is based on presence of connective tissues between the articulating bones. They can also be classified functionally. So how much motion they afford. In synovial joints, they're relatively immobile. For amphiarthrotic joints, they're slightly movable, but most of the joints of, especially the axial skeletons, are diarthrotic. They allow considerable amounts of motion. So starting out with the fibrous classification, the bones are joined by very dense fibrous tissues, and because of this, they permit virtually no movement. Perfect example of this is found in the skull. The sutures of the skull are connected or attached via very dense fibrous connective tissues. And the reason for this is that the primary function of the skull is protection. It's not movement like most of the rest of the skeleton. Its primary purpose is to protect the brain. And so we don't want the bones comprising the skull to be moving around. We want them relatively fixed so that they can protect that organ. Cartilaginous joints are where bone ends are connected by either a plate or a pad of cartilage. So there's no joint cavity like we'll see in the next joint classification, but since the bones are connected via cartilage, we have some motion. So these joints are slightly movable. One example is the cartilage found in the intervertebral disc. So it allows for little bits of motion to occur between each of the motion segments of the spine. And we also see that at the attachments of the ribs to the sternum. So it allows for a little motion, which is extremely important during ventilation. So we want our ribs to be able to move to a certain extent as our lungs fill and empty. And the last joint classification is synovial. So you can see here that the bone ends are separated by a joint cavity. So here we have the articular surfaces or the bone ends. And we have a joint cavity that surrounds the joint that's filled with synovial fluid. So it serves to decrease the friction between the two articular surfaces to help decrease wear. These joints are freely movable and are found in the majority of the joints in the body, especially the axial skeleton. So we're going to focus on the different types of synovial joints next, since they provide most of the motion of the human body. Starting off with a joint that provides the least amount of motion, the plane joint. So in the plane joints, the articular surfaces are relatively flat, or in some cases slightly curved, and we see this with the carpal bones of the hand. And so they allow a little bit of sliding relative to each other. So it allows for gliding movements. The hinge joint, on the other hand, affords a little bit more motion. An example of the hinge joint is the elbow joint. So we have the articular surface of the ulna that tracks on the articular surface of the humerus. So in this case, we have an articular surface that constrains the motion to a single plane, in this case, flexion and extension. A pivot joint affords motion in one plane as well. In this case, it's typically the transverse plane. So it allows for rotation excuse me, about a fixed axis of rotation. So some examples of that is the proximal radial ulnar joint. So here we have the head of the radius that's attached to the ulna. And so we have a constraining ligament here that allows the long axis of the bone to rotate about this articular surface. Condylar joints allow motion in two planes. We see this at the metacarpal phalangeal joints, where we have a relatively round articular surface and either a flat articular surface or articular surface with a slight concavity. So in this case, it allows flexion both in the sagittal plane, so flexion extension, as well as motion in the frontal plane, ab and adduction. The saddle joint allows motion in two planes as well. However, it's a little more specialized of a joint. It's called a saddle joint for obvious reasons. It is shaped like a saddle. So we have one surface that's convex and the mating surface that's concave. And so in this case, it's really the bony architecture that's constraining the motion to these individual planes. Ball and socket allows for motion in three different directions, so it allows for rotation about all three respective axes. We have two ball and sockets in the human body, the shoulder joint and the hip joint. So this type of joint allows for flexion and extension in the sagittal plane, ab and adduction in the frontal plane, as well as internal and external rotation about the longitudinal axis of the individual bones. So every muscle of the body is attached to a bone at two individual points. The origin is typically the most proximal and stationary. So it's typically less movable than the insertion. The insertion is typically located more distally, so the muscle spans a joint, attaches to the distal segment that is typically more mobile. Some movements allowed by synovial joints, if we look at the sagittal plane, we have flexion and extension. Flexion is when the angle between two adjacent segments decreases. And so in this case, we're moving our head forward. So it's decreasing the angle between the head segment and the trunk segment. And extension is when the angle increases between two adjacent segments. And so if we continue extension back past the anatomical position, we go into what is known as hyperextension. So it's essentially extension past the neutral or anatomical position. Ab and abduction is used to describe motion in the frontal plane. So abduction is when we move a segment farther away from the midline of the body, and adduction is when we bring the segment closer to or back towards the midline of the body. Circumduction isn't really an independent movement, it's actually a combination of both ab and adduction as well as flexion as extension. So it results in a circular motion at the very distal end of the extremity. And finally, we have rotation. We have internal and external rotation. This textbook uses lateral rotation to denote rotation going outward and medial rotation to denote rotation going inward. Oftentimes it's more intuitive to refer to it as external rotation. So you're rotating the, in this case, the lower leg externally. Or internal rotation, you're rotating the leg internally. And we do have a couple joints that have specific directional terminology. The foot is one of them, and the main reason for that is that the long axis of the foot is perpendicular to the long axis of most other body segments. So instead of using flexion and extension, we actually use the terms dorsiflexion as we bring the dorsal surface of the foot up towards the tibia, and plantar flexion as we move the plantar surface of the foot farther away. We also have different rotational terms about the longitudinal axis of the foot. So instead of external and internal rotation, we use eversion of the foot to denote moving the plantar surface of the foot more laterally, and inversion, which consists of moving the plantar or bottom surface of the foot more medially. And for the hand, instead of using internal and external rotation, we use supination, which is when we have a palm up or forward orientation. And in this orientation, in full supination, the forearm bones are actually parallel to each other. So the ulna and the radius are parallel. Pronation is when the palmar surface is oriented downward or posteriorly. And in this orientation, the radius actually crosses over the ulna. So the two forearm bones now are actually crossed while in pronation, and they're parallel in supination. So in conclusion, this week's lab covers exercises 10 and 11 in the lab manual. And the workbook assignment has been posted on Blackboard. You have multiple resources to use to cover and review this material. It is strongly encouraged that you work not only with the visible human body software, but also the articulated as well as disarticulated skeletons that are found in the lab.